dominant social paradigms and institutions. We're going to build on the discussion on environmental philosophy and ethics that we had previously. In that previous lecture, we learned that personal beliefs and values are really the foundation of how we individually interact with the environment. In this lecture, we're going to look at how these personal beliefs and values manifest them at the level of the society. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to articulate the concept of the dominant social paradigm, explain the difference between institutions and organizations, list key characteristics of institutions, and provide some examples of formal and informal institutions. You also should be able to explain what is needed for a shift in the dominant social paradigm and what happens as a consequence of this shift. Let's begin where we left off in the video on environmental philosophy and ethics. In that lecture, we discussed 4 environmental philosophies that have emerged from Western cultures: domination, stewardship, conservation, and deep ecology. And we also scratched the surface of one aspect of the indigenous perspective. But we didn't actually talk about how prevalent these perspectives and belief structures are in today's society. The term dominant social paradigm describes the most widely held set of beliefs, values, and ideals that guide our thinking about society, about governance, and about the role of individuals. The dominant social paradigm is the set of beliefs that determines how people perceive the world around them, how they expect the world to function, and how individuals interact with that world. When you think of the environmental philosophies that we discussed, what do you think is the dominant perspective that we see in today's societies? If we look at the world, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of our interactions with the environment are guided by the domination philosophy. Humans are typically trying to gain as much from the environment as possible, with relatively few considerations for the long term and, quite frankly, even the short term consequences of our actions. There are some of our actions that are guided by stewardship, and this is becoming as more and more economists and politicians and business people begin to accept the realities of ecology, that there are limits to the Earth system, and the idea that the survival of our species, humans, relies on functioning ecosystems. But the idea of intergenerational equality and equity that comes under stewardship is still challenging for many people in society. We have environmental initiatives that are driven by the conservation philosophy. So parts of the acts with respect to provincial parks or national parks where they aim to preserve wilderness just for the sake of wilderness itself and for future generations. And there are many conservation organizations, such as the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, or Oceana, an organization dedicated to protecting the world's oceans. So these kind of organizations definitely, and the people who belong to them, obviously are working towards a conservation ethic. There are probably very few people that subscribe to all the aspects of deep ecology. We talked about the idea previously that intergenerational equity is challenging for many people, this idea of protecting things for future generations of humans. And so if this is challenging under this idea of stewardship and conservation, then under deep ecology, the idea of interspecies equity, so protecting the future for other species, that's even more challenging for many people to accept. The care ethic perspective is deeply rooted in many indigenous people. Unfortunately, it's very rarely discussed at any sort of global level at all, and it is almost always overrun by the more dominant Western value systems. Despite some valuable efforts by citizens, environmental groups, and government agencies, the environmental attitude of today's most influential societies is still really domination. Now, of course, Western societies do not only define themselves over how they interact with the environment. Other beliefs and values of the dominant social paradigm of Western societies also include things like democracy, the acceptance of regulated capitalism, the concept of individualism, the belief in economic growth and the notion of progress, and faith in science and technology. So all of these aspects together represent the value system of Western societies. But how do these values manifest themselves in our society? In other words, how is the fact that we believe in democracy or capitalism reflected in our society? Through what mechanisms do they affect our daily lives? The dominant social paradigm, as compared to the dominant environmental paradigm that we just talked about, but the dominant social paradigm, it manifests itself in the totality of our institutions. Let's take a look at what this statement means. Let's start with the term institutions. What do we mean with this term? When people hear the term institution, they commonly think of landmark organizations. You might hear people say that Greenpeace is an institution, or the Hudson Bay Company is a Canadian institution, or the Emily Carr University of Art and Design is an institution in the Canadian art scene. However, the way social scientists define the term institution and how we are going to use it in this course are quite different from those ideas of buildings or organizations being institutions. Institutions are sets of rules and norms that govern the behavior of individuals and organizations in a system or in society. This is actually very different from what people commonly think of when we talk about institutions. So let's look at some examples to illustrate this definition. It is actually easiest to understand what institutions are when we contrast them to organizations. So, institutions are the accepted rules, norms, and strategies that individuals and organizations operate under. Organizations, on the other hand, are organized entities or bodies of a particular people with a particular purpose. An obvious example of an institution is the Canadian Constitution. That defines how our political system is set up. It includes federalism, which states that the power is shared between the federal and provincial governments, the legislative processes, which describe the process of how laws are made, and it describes the rights and responsibilities of citizens. However, the Parliament of Canada is an organization that operates within the rules of the Constitution. As described by the definition on the right, the parliament of an organized body of people with a purpose. That's what an organization is. These people include the senators, the members of parliaments, with all their staff, and their purpose is to govern Canada through making laws, setting taxes, and authorizing government spending. Other critical organizations within the Canadian Constitution are the Crown, which is the head of state, the executive branch, which includes the Prime Minister and the Cabinet that execute and enforce the law, and the judicial system, which represented by the courts, which interpret the law. An easy way to remember the difference between institutions and organizations is this quote from Jung, which says, "We often say the institutions are the rules of the game, and the organizations are the players in these institutions." Here's a slightly different perspective that focuses a little bit more on the purpose or role of institutions. Institutions are sets of expectations and norms that shape human behavior. Our institutions structure social order and, in particular, who has control over what. In other words, institutions define how we interact with each other and who can tell who what to do or what not to do. There's also the statement from Douglas North, and it's useful because it nicely summarizes the points that we've talked about so far. And it highlights the fact that these rules are made by humans. In other words, these rules are not universal laws that are given to us from the universe or from nature. In the contrary, we just came up with these rules to help us create functional societies. Let's look at some of the key characteristics of institutions. The first aspect that I would like to highlight is that institutions can be both formal and informal. Examples of formal institutions are the law in general, or marriage, for example. These types of institutions are established and enforced through official channels like the government or a church. And it might often seem like these types of institutions are forced upon us, but in a democracy, the people who create the rules are generally voted into these positions by power of the people. And so this highlights that voting is a really important part of our political system because through that process, these types of institutions can change. But institutions can also be informal rules and expectations that emerge from communities more directly. It might simply be a group of people who want to better define how they interact with each other. Examples of this type of institutions are family rules that define who does chores or backcountry camping ethics. These types of institutions don't have to be formally written down as long as they are shared socially. And interestingly, these types of informal institutions are often more persistent and effective than formal institution rules because these informal rules have broad buy-in from the communities that they emerge from. Let's look at some examples. As we discussed earlier, the Canadian Constitution is an excellent example of a formal institution. Now, how is a constitution relevant for natural resources and environmental challenges? The Constitution is essential because the Constitution grants the federal and provincial governments different rights and different responsibilities over natural resources and the environment. The federal government has control over interprovincial issues and over international issues. This includes things like fisheries, international environmental treaties, and cross-provincial infrastructure, like pipelines. The provincial government, on the other hand, has control over natural resources within their provincial boundaries. This includes both renewable resources, like trees, and non-renewable resources, like oil and gas. It's this mixture of jurisdictions that makes things like the carbon tax or getting oil to international markets such a political challenge. In the case of the carbon tax, the federal government has made commitments to the international community to reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, but some provinces believe that the carbon tax intrudes on the province's right to regulate their own natural resources. In the case of getting oil and gas to international markets, the issue, for example, is that Alberta has jurisdiction over their oil and gas fields. The federal government has the power to approve pipelines that cross provincial boundaries, and British Columbia has the authority and duty to protect its environment within its provincial boundaries. So you have three parties with very different objectives and somewhat conflicting powers. Another example of a written institution at the international level is the Institutional and Financial Arrangements for International Environmental Cooperation, which was established by the United Nations in 1972 after the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. This resolution is the foundation of the United Nations Environmental Programme, which oversees all the environmental programs and initiatives of the United Nations. It is also the foundation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which are key players in the international response to climate change. And we will get back to talking about this later on in the course. Here are some examples of informal or unwritten institutions. For example, a group of resource users, like anglers that you see in this picture, might decide to come together and create their own rules on how they want to use their own fishing grounds. Another example of an informal institution would be the norms that define culturally appropriate behavior. And a recent example for this is the use of single-use plastic grocery bags. Over the last few years, it has become socially unacceptable to use single-use plastic bags at grocery stores. By now, many municipalities, including Vancouver, are going ahead with banning single-use plastics in general. So more formal rules are being put in place. However, these formal legislative rules and regulatory rules initiated from informal grassroots movements around plastic single-use bags. So we have three main levels of institutions. First, we have constitutions and laws and rules, and these govern the politics, governments, and finance, and define some of the base rules for how people interact with each other in our society. Next, we have written contracts that people and companies use. They write things down and sign them to define how they're going to interact with each other. And then there are codes of conduct and behaviors. And these aren't written down, but we all know them, how to behave in societal settings. And for the most part, we all abide by them. Another key characteristic of institutions is that they structure policies and influence behavior. We already talked about this a little bit. And if we start from the top, the Constitution describes who the key players are and what types of power those people have. Under the Constitution, the federal and provincial governments have the authority to enact environmental laws that aim to make companies and citizens behave in specific ways. The carbon tax, for example, aims to create the necessary incentives for companies and people to move away from fossil fuels and to limit the amount of CO2 emissions that we emit into the atmosphere. The traditional definition of the institution of marriage has been changed in many jurisdictions to include same-sex marriages. And similar to this idea of single-use plastic bags, smoking in restaurants and bars was completely acceptable 15 years ago, but now we have strict non-smoking regulations. Now, changes in institutions do not happen quietly by themselves. Instead, these changes occur because the existing ways of doing things are challenged and contested. This can happen in the streets with public protests. This can be fought in the courts. For example, a good example of court cases that resulted from the Exxon Valdez oil spill that occurred in Alaska in the spring of 1989. Exxon Valdez was an oil tanker bound for California, and it struck the ground in Prince William Sound up on the Alaska coast and spilled up to 38 million US gallons of crude oil into a pristine marine ecosystem. It was considered to be one of the most devastating human-caused environmental disasters, and it was the largest oil spill in US waters, so just north of BC and Alaska, until the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So over the next 20 years, Exxon challenged the amount of punitive damages or fines that they had to pay for their wrongdoing. These are fines that are on top of payments that Exxon had to pay for the cleanup. After going through several courts, the US Supreme Court eventually decided that Exxon had to pay $500 million in punitive fines. So it is through hearings and deliberations in the courts that we can decide how environmental disasters like this are handled. And once they're settled, these cases become precedent and inform future cases. The Exxon Valdez case is considered one of the major environmental court cases in the 20th century. Let's summarize the key characteristics of institutions. They can be formal or informal. They structure policies that influence behavior. Institutions are constantly changing and evolving, and institutions are often contested and challenged by various means, whether it be public process or legal action. Let's look at where we are today by returning to the discussion of the dominant social paradigm and how it relates to our environmental challenges that we face today. Institutions are founded on our value system, which is expressed by the dominant social paradigm. The dominant social paradigm of most Western societies include the notions of democracy, an acceptance of regulated capitalism, the idea of individualism, a belief in continuous economic growth and the notion of progress, trust in science and technology, and the domination over the environment. Our institutions that define how our societies function reflect these values, and these institutions provide the rules for how organizations, companies, and individuals behave. Now, our society's institutions depend on a broad support and quote unquote sufficient consensus that the values and norms of a social paradigm are valid. In the end, it is the actions of the individual players that operate within our institutions that have resulted in the environmental challenges that we are dealing with today. If our social paradigm does not seriously value the environment, our institutions will not adequately protect that environment, and the organizations will take full advantage of the environment to maximize the benefits of those organizations. It's necessary to realize that while it is the actions of the organizations that brought us to where we are today, the fundamental root cause is our current dominant social paradigm and the institutions that have emerged from that paradigm. Now, the value system of a society can change, and this can change over time as we learn new things through science or other means, or as we find inconsistencies or injustices in the current dominant social paradigm. In the climate change debate, for example, the scientific evidence is slowly but surely convincing people that humans need to take better care of the planet and protect the resources and ecosystem services that we all need and other species need to survive. Another example is the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's a good example of a situation where people finally have enough. They wake up to the inconsistencies and injustices in our social paradigm. If we claim that everybody is equal in front of the law, the injustices that Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, and minorities experience are seen as unacceptable. Once you see and recognize these inconsistencies, you look at the world with a new perspective based on this new knowledge, and you can't look at it in the old way anymore, and your personal values change forever. When the values of an entire society change, the institutions start to lose support and new institutions form. And this means that substantial shifts in the dominant social paradigm of a society manifest itself in changes in the institutions. In other words, once we start translating the changing values into rules about how we can interact with each other and the environment, we can make progress towards a better future. Here are some of the key points that you want to take away. The term dominant social paradigm refers to the most widely held set of beliefs, values, and ideals that represents how a society overall behaves, and this can include how that society interacts with the environment. We distinguish between institutions and organizations. Institutions are the rules that we have come up with that define how we interact with each other and the environment, and organizations are the players that act within these rules. You want to make sure you know the difference between these two terms. Fundamentally, institutions influence the behavior of organizations and people through policy and policy tools. We've looked at some of the key characteristics of institutions. We saw that institutions can be written and formal, like the Canadian Constitution, or they can be informal, like the codes of conduct that you develop for your tutorials when you're learning how to interact with each other. We also saw that institutions can be challenged in different ways, and as a result, the institutions are constantly changing in response to the changes in society. At the end of this discussion, we looked at how changes in a society's institutions can be a sign of a shift in the dominant social paradigm. In the next lectures, we will look at some of our institutions in more detail to get a better understanding of why we interact with the environment in the way that we do. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.